Good morning and good evening from everybody that's joining us from the States. Good morning in Korea. I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time out of your schedules to be part of this guest speaker discussion coffee chat series with Larry Wilkerson. Before we get started, I'd like to hand the floor over to Wei Chao, the president of the FAOA Korea chapter.
All right.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We have a very special guest. Look forward to hearing more of his insights. He's got a wealth of experience, wealth of insight from across the interagency, intergovernmental spheres. So I'm glad for everyone that was able to join us today and tap into his wellspring of knowledge. So for today, I just want to remind everyone that today we'll be speaking on the record. Today's session will be recorded and will be placed up on social media and YouTube. So please bear that in mind when asking your questions and having your discussion. And then for the sequence of events, we'll start with about 30 minutes of a few opening questions that the board of FAOA Korea chapter has developed, followed by 30 minutes of open discussion with our speaker, Colonel retired Larry Wilkerson. Back to you, Adrian. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. All right, for those of you who do not know Larry Wilkerson, I would like to begin with his bio and short introduction. So thank you, Larry. Thank you, Mr. Wilkerson, for joining us today. For those, he has been a distinguished visiting professor of government. He served 31 years of military, where his final assignment was Special Assistant Chief of Staff to General Colin Powell. He also is currently serving as a senior non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute, responsible for statecraft and co-founder of the All Volunteer Force Forum. So, Mr. Wilkerson, if you could please provide some insights and some of your expertise on the floor before we get to the first question. I'd like to open it up with you, sir.
Okay. I think we ought to just go. We've only got an hour, right?
Yeah, we got an hour, sir.
Yeah, why don't we just, you provided some good questions. Why don't we just go right into those?
Will do. So you had a unique honor of serving at the highest level of both military and diplomacy. What are some of the best practices you've witnessed, and especially for the military, how can they best enable diplomacy and foreign policy?
That's an interesting question, especially from the perspective that I saw working at the highest levels of arguably the most powerful country in the world in both diplomatic and military means. I saw a lot of mistakes made, and the mistakes were made principally because the military got in the way of the diplomats, or the diplomats got in the way of the military. And that's not the way it should be. Frederick the Great made the ultimate statement when he said diplomacy without the military is like an orchestra without music, or an orchestra without instruments, depending on whose German you translate. It's the other way around too. Both need one another. But what's happened in the last 20 years in particular, let's say since 9/11, and my experience, what's happened in the last 40 years,
you got a hot mic, Mason.
The military has become so powerful that it often pushes diplomats aside. And let me give you an anecdote to show you what I mean. I'm meeting with the Japanese foreign minister, and he's saying to me in English, Larry, you realize when the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific, Jim Kelly at the time, comes to visit me, he comes with a briefcase, and it's often empty. Contrarily, the commander in Hawaii, the combatant commander, when he comes with carrier strike groups, Army divisions, Marine amphibious groups, and Air Force bomber and fighter wings behind him. Whom do you think we listen to? Whom do you think my prime minister listens to? And this is true worldwide. I served a man in the Pacific Command, Admiral Bill Crowell, and his assistant J5, Admiral Stu Ring, now passed away sadly, and also Bill passed away. who understood this nexus. And that's good because they knew that when they published their peacetime strategy, for example, which took into account 35 nations in the Pacific AOR, and all the ambassadors in those nations met with those ambassadors and crafted the peacetime diplomacy that would be affected by those ambassadors in the region, they knew that they were, shall we say, second fiddle to the diplomats in peacetime. In wartime, the other way around. Then the diplomats are second fiddle to the SINC, or to the combatant commander today. So I think that's one of the biggest problems. And Powell was very aware of that when he was chairman, and he emphasized over and over with the combatant commanders and with the chairman, with the other members of the Joint Chiefs, that, hey, look, the diplomats are in charge in peacetime, and don't get out in front of them. Don't do things like, and here's another example, April 2001, an EP-3 collides with a Chinese F-8 fighter. The fighter pilot dies, the plane crashes, and the EP-3 is so damaged it has to go down on one of the most highly militarized portions of China, Hainan Island. And the P-3 is there amongst the Chinese with all the secure gear on it and everything else. Well, we solved that crisis in a short period of time, but one of the reasons the P-3 hit the F-8 was maybe the combatant commander in Hawaii had moved the P-3 in a little bit too close. Don't know, but that's the military making diplomatic policy in process. I mean, it's making the policy. So I would say the biggest thing I learned, and the thing Powell taught me most emphatically, was that the diplomats lead in peacetime, the military leads in wartime. It's not that cut and dry, of course, because you don't often today have a very good definition when you're at war and when you're not at war, or when you're using force and when you're not using force. But I found that whether it was Barry McCaffrey, the J5 at the time, or it was Stu Ring, the J5 in the Pacific Command, or it was anyone else who was a diplomatist as well as being in uniform, that they understood this nexus. They understood that that's the way it should be. That's the way our republic was set up. Sometimes you meet military that don't understand that, though, and they want to get out in front and they want to be the lead on whatever's happening. And when you bring in what the Japanese foreign minister said to me, then that becomes a very powerful instrument of U.S. policy that maybe is not being worked the exact way it should. So that's the only caution I'd throw out there with regard. You also had a question in there about, let me make sure I get it right, enable greater unity of effort while remaining exemplars of our professionalism. I don't think there's a disconnect there. I think the one is the other and the other is the one. You have to be an exemplary professional to achieve unity of effort. And let me give you an anecdote here. When Powell took over the chairmanship, he was the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Goldwater-Nichols time, really. Goldwater-Nichols being the DOD Reorganization Act of 1986, which made the chairman, for the first time in U.S. history, the sole powerful advisor to the National Security Council, the Secretary of Defense, and the President. Not the committee of the Joint Chiefs, but the chairman himself. There was a proviso that they put into the law that said if there was a dissenting chief on any decision, then the chairman was obligated to take that dissent to the president. It didn't specify how he would do that. It didn't specify who would check up on him if he did that or didn't do that. One of the first things that happened with Powell after he had made it clear to everyone that he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he did this in a number of ways. For example, he took the commandant of the Marine Corps aside and told him not to chew tobacco in his office, not to bring a spit cup into his office. He took another service chief aside and said, don't bring any of your horse holders. Don't bring any of your, your bagmen. You have to come into my office for meetings with me only with yourself. That means you got to know the issues. You can't turn to colonel or brigadier general or three-star general and say, hey, Harry, could you answer the chairman's question? means you got to know the answer. So by these techniques, he taught the other members of the Joint Chiefs that he was the Goldwater-Nichols chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for sure. And then along came about a year later, a dissent from the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Powell had made his decision. He'd cleared it with the Secretary of Defense, and he was taking it to the president. The Chief of Staff of the Air Force dissented. Here's what Powell did. He went to President H.W. Bush and he said, here's my recommendation, Mr. President, and the Secretary of Defense agrees. But we have a dissent from the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. We need to let you know about that. And the president said, set up a lunch in the White House in the Oval. And the Chief of Staff of the Air Force went over and had lunch with the president, was there for about an hour 15. And the president heard him out. And at the end of the expression of the Chief of Staff of his dissent, the president said, I've heard what you've said and I appreciate it and I respect your opinion, but I'm siding with the Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And that happened once more during the 4 years of his chairmanship. And each time Powell did that. That's exemplary professionalism, integrity, all that goes along with it, and unity of effort, because after the president's made his decision, then everyone's together and everyone has had his say and everyone understands what the decision is and what they have to do to execute it. So I think that's a wonderful example of, even at the highest levels of national power, how you maintain the two things.
That's good, sir, to hear that. And so I heard you say earlier about peacetime diplomacy and policy and unity of effort, and given the complications, not really complications, but the we see the rhetoric of North Korea constantly fighting, shooting on a daily here. So we kind of get that. And do you think that kind of diplomacy and peacetime diplomacy policy is kind of resonating and aligned with current affairs in North Korea and addressing that problem set?
That's an interesting question. I think you have a couple of places on the planet right now, Taiwan Straits being one, maybe Iran being another one, and certainly Korea and the peninsula in general being one, where diplomacy and the military meet each other every day, 24/7. And so the military has to be very, very careful that it understands exactly what's happening with diplomacy. And this is just as important, the diplomatist, whether it be the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, or the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, or anyone else in the chain, an ambassador in any one of the countries, especially Korea or Japan, they have to be sure that they understand what the military is doing. And they have to be sure that they're in sync. And that's not always the easiest thing to do, especially when it's day by day or even hour by hour. I remember when I took the Marine Corps War College seminar to Korea for the first time. And here we are, 14 students, all lieutenant colonels, 6 Marines, 2 soldiers, 2 sailors, 2 airmen, and a CIA guy. And we're all meeting with the sync. That's what we called him then. We even called Gary Luck that on the peninsula then. But he had so many titles you couldn't keep up with him. But he's telling us about how close he is to war. And he's really fearful that we're going to war. And Defense Secretary at the time, Bill Perry, had just been there. And it just so happened that we had met with Secretary of Defense Bill Perry the day before at his behest and spent an hour with him. So my students, especially the Marines, you got to watch these Marines. They're brave. They'll stand up and say anything to anybody. They kind of stood up and said, well, this is what Secretary Perry said. And General Luck was, whoa, how do you know that? And there was clearly sort of a disconnect between what Secretary Perry had said and what General Luck said. Anyway, they worked it out. But you got to make sure that there isn't those disconnects, especially when you're in such a critical situation as Korea.
Thanks, sir. That's a good answer. And hearing that, especially in what we see in North Korea, but also to top that off with what's going on in North Korea, and how they've been kind of testing their capabilities, I would say. There's a lot of discussion about the possibility of Russia's use with the nuclear weapons. And what are your thoughts and possibilities of them using that in spite of with what North Korea is doing, as far as they're saying there's another nuclear test going on? But do you think Russia has or will test or shoot nuclear weapons?
Let me just make a brief comment about North Korea. I've been on the peninsula almost every year from 1976 or so forward until recently. And so I feel like I know, I probably worked Korea when I was at state more than anything else. I mean, when we went to talk to Kang Sok-ju and Yi-gun about the nuclear problem, and they shocked us by saying, of course we have nuclear weapons. We were like, whoa, okay, we just got an admission out of them that they have nuclear weapons. The Kim dynasty, and certainly Kim Jong-un, craves attention. He's got to have attention, and we've been ignoring him ever since he had his, kiss and tell session with President Donald Trump. We've been ignoring him basically, and so he fires off all these missiles and everything to get our attention again. Well, I say that, but it's still dangerous, as you implicated. It is dangerous that it's happening, and you never know when one of those missiles is either through accident or intent, like the ones that flew over Japan, going to do something a little more damaging. And so you have to watch it all the time. But it is a situation that's understandable from the perspective of Kim Jong-un. And I'm wondering, I really am wondering when Blinken and Sullivan and Biden are going to get around to focusing on North Korea again, because that's what he wants. He wants some attention, especially from the big superpower. Now, the other part of your question with regard to Ukraine, I was worried about this very much so when we seem to be going at it in an existential way. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we wanted to bring Putin down. We wanted to really mess Russia up. And we were going to use Ukraine to do it. That seemed to be what President Biden and his crew were working on there for a time. And it seemed to be what Jan Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, was doing. And it seemed to be more or less in sync with a lot of the more powerful NATO countries, with the exception maybe of France and Germany, who often registered some reservations. And then you looked at Putin's doctrine, and Putin's doctrine, published doctrine now. People will deny this, but we know from the Finns and the Swedes who watched their military maneuvers in 2014 and 2015 and reported back to us, we know that their doctrine is they fear our precision-guided munitions, ours and NATO's. And so they feel like the only way they can compensate for that is with a small-yield tactical nuclear weapon. So they have said that they will blunt any penetration by NATO, for example, into their territory, the CSTO territory, their complement to NATO, with a nuclear weapon. And they then go on and say they would escalate to de-escalate, which is, I think, nonsense. If you lived through the Cold War, you know that there's no such thing as escalating with nuclear weapons to de-escalate in general. What you do is you keep going, and that's bad news. All that said, unless we make it absolutely existential for Putin, in other words, he wakes up one morning and says, I'm going down. I'm going down by 5 o'clock today. I don't think we need to fear the use of a nuclear weapon. But if we make it that bad, if we make it that way for him, then I do fear that he might use a nuclear weapon. Now, here's the optimism I have right now. I think President Biden and his whole team were very, very reluctant and even afraid to show any ankle, as it were, on Ukraine, because the media has made it such a hyped up thing. They were very, very frightened of doing anything diplomatically until the midterms were over, because they were afraid they'd really get paid back in the midterms. Because the media has made the American people think that Eritrea and Ethiopia and Yemen, where many more people are dying than are dying in Ukraine, are just insignificant, and Ukraine is everything. Ukraine is the war. It's the war. It's the place where America has to stand fast and so forth. And there's a certain validity to that because it's in the heart of Europe, but it is sort of media focus that's done this. Now that the midterms are over and Biden's party did not do that badly, in fact, did a lot better than expected, I think we're going to see diplomacy. And what we've just heard here, I think I can say this, is that Bill Burns, the best diplomat in the American government right now. He happens to be director of the CIA, but he's the best diplomat in the government. He was Powell's assistant secretary for Near Eastern affairs. Very, very good diplomat, is already on it. He's already on the job. And we're going to see probably a meeting of even higher level Americans and Russians very shortly. I hope that's true. I really hope that's true, because I think the same thing's true with China. You may have seen today that Xi Jinping let it be known that he's willing to meet with Biden, and Biden has made it known that he's willing to meet with Xi. So maybe we'll calm down this business about Taiwan a little bit too. Both of those situations are really what we call in the jargon of today near peer power, if not peer power conflicts. And we'd have a hard time right now. Do you know that our army right now is smaller than the army of Bangladesh? The army fell 27,000 people short on its recruiting goal this past year. The Navy is now taking 41-year-olds as enlistees. All the services are paying huge bonuses. The Navy's paying as much as $115,000. So we're not in the best shape right now. And when the chiefs and General Milley say to the Congress, we need more money, what they're really saying is, we're in trouble.
So near peer power and saying we're in trouble with our strength and force. Do you think we have what we need in place to at least withstand what's going on in the region, specifically Asia?
With regard to nuclear weapons, we're not in any trouble. We're not in any trouble. We probably got 6,000 plus left. The
Right.
Russians have about 6,000. I'd like to see us go down a little more. You know, the Moscow Treaty in 2002 that Colin Powell and John Bolton negotiated took us down to around 1,200 each, and we were going there. Americans forget this. We were destroying Russian weapons. We were in the Soviet Union / Russia destroying their weapons and going like wildfire. I mean, we were getting, the Army and others were getting rid of them as fast as they possibly could. And all of a sudden, we hit this bump with Yeltsin at the end of his time, and then with Putin, of course, and we stopped doing it. But we were, by that treaty, the Moscow Treaty it was called, it was only a 3-page treaty. We were going down to 1,200 weapons each. Well, a range of 2,000 to 1,200 to 2,000. And most of the most dangerous weapons were going to be eliminated, like the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty had done. Now we're off of that. We've gotten rid of all our arms control. We have no treaties left except New START. And I would be willing to bet you that Putin, in his present state of mind, will not be willing to renew New START when it comes up. So we're in a dangerous world right now with regard to nuclear weapons. In fact, I'd say we're in the most dangerous world we've been in since Berlin in '61 and the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62. Very dangerous situation.
Thanks, sir. In the interest of time, I'd like to get to our last question and leave it to the audience for open discussion. In your years of service, what is the best professional advice you received from mid-grade or senior military officers and international specialists?
You know, I've had the distinct honor of serving with some really great people. Barry McCaffrey, Colin Powell, of course, Admiral Stu Ring, Admiral James Crow, Admiral Ron Hayes, a host of people who were just stellar human beings and exceptionally good military officers. And I have to say good diplomats too, especially Admiral Crow and Admiral Ring. Admiral Crow and Admiral Ring are dead now. There are some people like them in the entourage of military and diplomatists that we have today. But I find the basic character of these kinds of people diminished somewhat, and that's really disturbing. And what do I mean by basic character? I mean the kind of character that it takes to stand up to power and tell it the truth, regardless of the threat to your own career or the danger involved in giving that truth. And on the other end, the presidents and the secretaries of state and the secretaries of defense who reward that, who understand that that's what they want, really. They want people to tell them the truth. One of the first things Colin Powell said to me when he hired me, don't ever spend any money for me. Whoa, where's this coming from? And he smiled and he said, I mean, if I were to tell you, go get me a cup of coffee, you asked me for the $2. You know, it was $2 then. It's probably $4 now. Don't ever spend any money on my behalf. And what he was telling me, as he later let me know well, was that spun off into just everything that he did. There was no sense of slavery about working for Colin Powell. You know, you were in every respect, human and otherwise, his equal, other than the stars on his shoulder and the fact you were his subordinate. When it came to doing things that involved character, you were equals, and he expected the same kind of display of high character from you as you expected from him. And he delivered and you delivered, or you parted. I mean, that was this simple way it was. Once I heard a story that will tell you as much about the integrity of these people that I work for as anything you want to hear. Colin Powell and his wife, Alma, were looking for quarters when they came as majors to Washington for the first time. They could not find anything. And the reason they couldn't find anything was because no one wanted to rent or sell to a Black person, let alone to a Black family. They had children at that time. And so General Jim Kreisel, who would later be my boss at U.S. ThinkPAC, PACOM, what's it called now? India PACOM.
Indo-PACOM.
Yeah. I can't keep up with the changes. But Jim Kreisel would later be the deputy J5 to Admiral Ring, for whom I was the executive assistant. And so I'm hearing all this. And what happened was Jim Kreisel lived south of Washington on Highway 95, and he heard about Colin's problem. And so he said, come live with us. Bring your family and come live with us until you can find a place. So you stayed there for about 6 months before they finally found someone who would rent to a Black. Now, this is the early 70s, a little bit different in Virginia at that time. It's still not the way it should be, but, Blacks still have a problem finding someplace. Especially in a white neighborhood, an established white neighborhood or whatever. So later, this all happened. Later, Kreisel comes in to take command of the 25th Infantry Division up at Schofield Barracks. But he's a brigadier before he's promoted to 2 stars and takes division command, and he's got to get his joint duty. This is Goldwater Nichols again, he's got to get his joint duty. So he's sent to PACOM, Pacific Command at that time, to be the deputy J5. So he comes into me. I'm the executive assistant to the J5, who's a brilliant Navy admiral, diplomatist, internationalist, and Navy. And he comes in and he sits down in my office and he says, you got to help me. I said, General, how am I supposed to help you? He said, you're the guy who's working for the big guy there, the admiral who knows everything. I got to be his deputy. And when he travels, you cut orders and make me him. Yeah, that's right, sir. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm a soldier. I'm a ground pounder. I don't know anything about this diplomacy. So I said, okay, let's work something out. And we worked out a deal where anytime he was in trouble on the bridge, with the admiral, he would call me and I'd give him the answer or whatever. Anyway, we worked it out and he made it through that year, went up and took over the 25th Division. Here's the kicker to the story. Becomes a 3-star general and takes over Army Military Personnel Center in Washington. And guess who Powell calls to ask for an assistant when he becomes chairman of the joint, or actually when he went down to Forces Command before chairman. He calls Kreisel, and Kreisel says, well, Wilkerson is a good guy for that job. So this is the way things come around when you work with people who are looking for people like themselves, who have decent character and pretty high integrity, tell them the truth, don't lie, and so forth. That's the way it should be. Sometimes today we miss this in centralized promotion boards and things like that. You know, the old good guy army where you got promoted based on your latest boss or your previous boss's recommendations was, yeah, it was kind of corrupt. Yeah. But I'm not so sure that centralized promotion boards are a whole lot better because they don't take these kind of things into consideration. You know, I would probably have never gone to work for Powell if it hadn't been for Kreisel and the experience we had together at the Pacific Command. So integrity begets integrity, and professionalism begets professionalism. And the opposite is true too. You know, lying and cheating and stealing begets lying, cheating, and stealing. So it's incumbent on us all to stay as honest as we can, to tell the truth to our superiors and to our colleagues also, and be honest with our subordinates as well, all around. That's, I think, the best way to do business.
Thanks, sir. So I'd like to open the floor for the audience. If there's any questions, please use the raise hand function. I have Scott Morrissey. Go ahead.
Hey, good day, Mr. Wilkerson. First, I just wanted to say, for my question, I wanted to say thank you for like your decades of speaking candidly about dynamics in the halls of power. From political science background, sometimes, you know, world events are determined by, you know, structural dynamics, big forces, but sometimes they're determined by actors. And I've always found you can't always understand it without understanding the actors, and your insights over the decades have been invaluable to that end. That's not
that's
my
that's what I teach. I teach people.
Yes, people can be quite consequential, especially, you know, the right or wrong personalities in the right or wrong place. I guess this question also relates to people. Here in Korea, we have a fine historic tradition of fighting while negotiating. We learned how to do this the hard way with a lot of speed bumps involved in the 1950s. I'd like to think it would be a bit easier this time around in the nuclear age, where we've got forces that might kind of compel us down this route. But you said something earlier that, you know, in a kind of an ideal situation, you know, Secretary Powell taught you that the diplomats lead in peacetime and the soldiers lead in wartime. But in perhaps a new crisis in Korea where we are fighting while negotiating, what would be the best way to deconflict this? Because it's just easy for me to see that we're involved in a war of limited objectives. There will be a substitute for victory, and that what we're trying to do is generate battlefield pressure for our diplomats. But that in a crisis environment will be an interesting conversation, to say the least. What are your thoughts on this? Over.
Well, I've given a lot of thought to that, believe it or not. In fact, Powell and I and Jim Kelly, the Assistant Secretary for East Asia and Pacific, and others, Director of the Foreign Service, for example, when we were really involved in October 2002 with Pyongyang and the Chinese and the six-party talks in general, lots of thought to this, because we were convinced that there was at least maybe a 30-40% chance that we might have a war break out on the peninsula at any time. It wasn't as bad as what Gary Luck insinuated in the story I told before, but it still was worrisome. And the question you just asked came up constantly: where does diplomacy end and where does the war start, and where does conflict and the use of force start? It doesn't really. And the peninsula, I think, is a place where this is just critical, unless it goes nuclear. Now, if it goes nuclear, all bets are off. That's what Clausewitz called total war. And Clausewitz said total war was absurd. And I think it is. Total war is absurd. And nuclear weapons are the ultimate absurdity. But you still got to deal with them. You've got to deal with that absurdity, and you've got to try to avoid it. if you can keep it short of that and still come to some way of achieving not a win-win situation possibly, but a lose-lose situation that's comfortable with both sides. And by comfortable, I mean you can live with it. And we're looking at that in Ukraine right now, I think, too. You're not going to have a win-win situation when Zelensky and Biden and Putin and whomever else sit down, especially Zelensky, I think. You're going to have a lose-lose situation. You're going to have a little crow eating on both sides, much the way we did over the EP3 and the Chinese F8. We could have gone to war there. Powell got on the cell phone when Chen Chi-chen, the Chinese party, was traveling in South America. And the NSA got all over him afterwards because it was a clear line. And he said, "To heck with you, NSA. I'm doing diplomacy. Clear line. I'm talking on a clear line. They're on a clear line. They know they're on a clear line. I know I'm on a clear line. We need to stop this crisis in its tracks." And of course we did, but it was dicey there for a little while. I think it would be even more dicey. It would be even more critical and perhaps even dangerous to the extent that Kim Jong-un has the resources he does at his beck and call. And that's one reason why I kept advising all along that I didn't think the North Koreans would actually do what people were saying they would do, that they were just looking for attention in a diplomatic sense, and in a real sense, economic assistance and economic help, because they were really in dire straits. So you have to, everybody has to understand this. You have to keep the military power there ready to act in case you're wrong, but you also have to ferret out what that lose-lose situation is. Maybe you want to call it a win-win situation. You do in the press, of course, but it's probably more like a lose-lose situation. He loses a little bit, and you lose a little bit, but you don't go to war and lose a lot. And that's what it's all about, orchestrating those two instruments at the same time. It's the most difficult situation in the world. We have not done it very well. Look at how badly we did in Iraq. Look at how badly we did in Afghanistan. That's because we never achieved the political objectives we were after, because we constantly stymied the diplomacy. And let me give you an example. David Petraeus, President Karzai, and the ISAF group, all the leaders in Afghanistan decided that it was conducive to success to prosecute the worst warlord in Afghanistan, who was selling drugs and other things just at total freedom. They got to the courtroom. They got to the door of the courtroom, and the CIA intervened and pulled the guy away because he was their contact with the ISI in Pakistan, and they felt like they would lose that if they didn't get him out of his peril. Neither Petraeus nor Karzai had the power to stop them. Now, that's wrong. That's absolutely wrong, but that's what happened. Now, I'm not saying that would have made our situation in Afghanistan better, but I think it would have opened the road to making it better and making a political solution that was palatable to everyone, and a more successful situation in Afghanistan more likely, more possible. But we did that. And we let the CIA run the situation in Afghanistan. This is yet to be written in history. It has not been revealed to the extent that it should be. The war in Afghanistan was the CIA's, not the DOD's.
And now we know why Petraeus went to CIA afterwards, perhaps.
Got a point there, too.
Okay, is there any additional questions? Josh.
Hey, sir. Lieutenant Commander Josh Duran here. I'm the secretary for the Foreign Area Officers Association Korea chapter, as well as a FAO that works at the SCO here in Korea. Thank you for joining us today. I do have kind of a general question that I like to ask anytime I have the opportunity to ask somebody more senior and experienced, because we always tend to get interesting answers that come out of it. But as diplomats, as foreign area officers, what, and I'm not talking about strictly material that we come across when we're in the line of duty, so to speak. But what should we be reading? What should we be consuming in terms of books, journals, magazines, and other publications, even blogs? What are those resources that we should be seeking out in order to shape our thinking and give us a deeper, more critical thinking ability? Over.
Wow, that's a good question. I get that a lot from my students at William & Mary and at George Washington when I was teaching there. You know, one of the things I tell them, because they expect me to say, read Kissinger's volumes, or, you know, read this or read that. I tell them about a gentleman by the name of Alan First, who is, what he is a historian par excellence who writes fiction. And his fiction is better than some historians. He writes about the period leading to World War II, the period of World War II, and the period immediately after World War II. And he focuses on things like the French Resistance, the Nazis, the Schutzstaffel, the SS, the Gestapo, the Sicherheitsdienst. He focuses on all the bureaucratic elements that surround this conflict. And if you want to see what it's like to really be in a situation where you are counting on everyone every minute to do their job, or you're going to jail or die, probably the latter. At one point, this particular Czechoslovakian count, who's really a super intelligence officer, spy, he says it was a really good thing you couldn't just count to 10 and say now, because most of the members of the French resistance would have done that because they knew their lifespan was 3 to 6 months, that the Gestapo would get them within that time frame. It's so revealing of what it takes to survive and to prosper. Prosper might not be the right word, but to succeed in that sort of environment as a diplomat and as a military officer. Many of these people are military officers too. They're in Poland, they're in Warsaw when the Germans invade, they're in Ukraine, they're involved in the Katyn Forest massacre, all these different things. And he is impeccable with his history. If you check any of his, Hitler said this, Rommel said this, Guderian said this, Renaud in France said this, Malraux said this, the Chinese said this, whatever it was, if you check that in the history books, he's right. It happened that way. The only thing that's fictional is he creates the environment that he thinks probably existed with all these people that created that history. You know who introduced me to him? Tom Finger, who was the Assistant Secretary of Intelligence at State, and later was the first deputy DNI when they created the Director of National Intelligence position. Tom is one of the finest intelligence officers I've ever met. Speaks fluent Mandarin, knows the Chinese inside and out, just a brilliant guy, low key, great character. But he said, Larry, you've got to read Alan First. You will not only like him and appreciate his writing talents, but he is a first-class historian. And it's all about diplomacy and military power and the meshing of the two. And there are other things too. I mean, I would tell my students, you know, if you want to know something about war, read book 8 of Clausewitz. Read all of Clausewitz if you want to. Remember that Clausewitz is writing about the guy who is his role model, Napoleon, because Clausewitz says the best case theoretically is to have the prince and the warrior, the diplomat and the soldier, if you will, in the same person. And that's what Napoleon was, especially when he made himself emperor. He was both the president and the general in one person, because that way you have unity of command, right? The unity of purpose and so forth. So Clausewitz is writing with Napoleon in mind, and Napoleon was indeed very successful. He was, you know, a tyrant, but he was very successful. Ultimately, that kind of person, I think, is his own worst enemy, which you find in First too. You find that these people paint their own destruction, whether it's Hitler ultimately, or whether it's some of the French generals or whatever, they paint their own destruction by their own obstinance or whatever. Most Americans have no conception that the French were better equipped all around at the start of the phony war than the Germans were. They have better tanks, they have better armaments, better machine guns, but they got whipped, and they got whipped in a matter of days. Why? Well, first tells you why. You see clearly why the French lost. They just basically given up, and they had terrible leadership. And of course, they lost the flower of their youth in that other conflict that they won a very Pyrrhic victory in, World War I. Some people say, first points out, that every third French man was gone in 1939, 1940. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about when I say these traditional things are good, things we recommend as professors, but a person like First, another one that does that too, in a little bit more of a Hollywood way, is Philip Kerr. Philip Kerr is also a really good writer, who very assiduous about making sure his history is right. And he puts Bernie Gunther, who's kind of his hero, in as a member of the Alexanderplatz police in Berlin when the war breaks out. And he's a good policeman. And the Nazis find him very useful, even though he hates their guts. But he's trying to survive. And just how Philip Kerr crafts the ways that he discovers to survive in this horrible environment of Reinhardt and the Gestapo and so forth is incredible. And Bernie's ready to kill him, count to 10 and commit suicide too by the time he gets to the end of the war.
Sir, I greatly appreciate those recommendations. Certainly, the reason I asked that question is to get non-standard recommendations, we'll say. Our association has a publication that we put out where we'll put out book reviews and things like that. And I think it would be very interesting if we could find a way to put either Alan First or you mentioned Philip Kerr, some of their works into our publication. So thank you for that recommendation.
Surely. I hope life of FAOs has gotten better since I was in. You were sort of third-class citizens when I was in.
Well, sir, I can only speak from my own experience, but I think that the combatant commanders and senior leadership certainly does see the value of what we can provide in terms of relationships with our counterparts and our allies. So I think that we're trending in the right direction, is my perspective.
That's good news. That's very good news. I had some really good friends who I thought I ought to have, at a minimum, made brigadier general or whatever, and been a DAT in a very big country or whatever, who just, they couldn't find room for them.
That's unfortunate, but I think we're turning in the right direction, sir.
Good.
All right, we're at the 50-minute mark. This is probably the last question. I'll leave it to Yet. Go ahead.
Yes. Hi, I'm Antoinette Dong with U.S. Embassy Seoul. Thank you, sir, for your observations. I do think that a couple FAOs here are first-class citizens here at our embassy, and I can testify because I collaborate and work with them. So I think FAOs are up there. In terms of diplomacy, we are curious as to what you think the long-term political objectives should be for the region with regards to China. So we're interested in some of those perspectives. Thank you. Over.
Well, I can only tell you what Powell and I talked about all the time, and President H.W. Bush. And again, Americans have not been told the truth with regard to China about George W. Bush. George W. Bush was very much in Powell's ballpark with regard to China. If it hadn't been for that support from the president, Chen Shui-bian, for example, might have taken us into a referendum for independence in Taiwan, and we might have had some real untoward actions by China toward Taipei. But Bush was on Powell's side with regard to that. And what do I mean by being on Powell's side? That we are strategic competitors and we are not bound for war. And this business of my old boss, Richard Haas, calling for strategic clarity with regard to Taiwan. And what he meant by that was, of course, everyone in the United States would stand up at one time and say, we will fight you to the death if you do anything untoward toward Taiwan. And as Ambassador Freeman said the other day, why would we want to disturb a policy that's been working for 40 years? Why would we want to do that? If it's going to quit working, then it's going to quit working with China using force to reestablish unity of Taiwan and the mainland. And then we have clarity. Then we have clarity. Then we can do something if we want to do something. Do we want to do something? Would you put an army the size of Bangladesh's in China? No, of course you wouldn't. You watch the movie, The Princess Bride. You know, you don't start a land war in Asia. You don't start one certainly with China. What do you do then? Well, you fight each other through your Air Force and your navies, and you attrit both greatly. And then you look at each other and say, wow, we haven't convinced you and you haven't convinced us. So let's go nuclear. Bad scenario. So I think George W. Bush was right, and H.W. Bush before him. You need to have a modus vivendi where you both can live in the world together, work together, cooperate. We couldn't exist during the time that George W. Bush was president, and he knew it, in terms of Walmart, Target, and half a dozen other stores in America or chains in America without China. But by the same token, neither of us could exist without the high quality chips that are coming out of Taiwan. And that worries me to an extent because Xi Jinping may covet having those things in his own bailiwick rather than being across the straits in Taiwan. But let's keep doing this as long as we can. And what is this? This is no war between China and the United States. I don't think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. John Mearsheimer and I have had this conversation at lunch. You know, John says, rising power, declining power, they're going to fight. Inevitable, there'll be a war. There'll be a war. And I say, John, that's crazy. You're going to make it a self-fulfilling prophecy. We do not have to fight. And besides, we have two challenges right now that are so huge that we fight and we distract ourselves from those challenges. One is nuclear weapons and some sort of arms control, beginning again with 9 nuclear weapon states now. We bring everyone into it, North Korea, Israel, we bring them all into the arms control regime. And the second one is the climate crisis. I'm just picking up the newspaper tonight and reading about the global south and how it's there now. It's already there. They just diverted enough water out of the Tigris and Euphrates up in Turkey that Basra and other countries down in Iraq and in Syria are going to have no water. The Tigris Euphrates complex is almost just a trickle now anyway down there. So, and we're having, in Basra, we're having 120, 125 degree temperatures day after day after day after day in the hot season. So they are already feeling it. And they're really, really angry with us because us being, you know, the peer powers up here, London, Japan, United States, we created it. We put most of the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And so they're angry with us for that and calling for reparations and everything else. I don't think that'll ever happen because there isn't enough money in the world to pay for that probably. But we do have 2 huge crises, one immediate in nuclear weapons with no arms control. We've gotten rid of the ABM Treaty, the INF Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, the Conventional Forces in Europe's Treaty, the INF Treaty, and we're about to get rid of START. No more arms control. That crisis, and we got the crisis of the climate. And we need cooperation and collaboration, not war.
All right, thank you, sir. Appreciate that. I think we have time for one last question from Mason Ritchie, and this will be the last one. Mason.
Hello. Good morning to everyone, and good evening to Mr. Wilkerson. My name is Mason Ritchie. Unlike many of the people here, I'm actually an academic. I'm a scholar. I teach at a university here in Korea. And just very briefly, I would like to ask your thoughts on how we can imagine the U.S.-ROC alliance relationship in terms of how it can continue to put pressure on North Korea while avoiding some of the problems of the security dilemma. It seems like we're moving into a very long-term deterrent relationship with North Korea, and obviously the security dilemma, sort of constantly plays a role in potential unwanted escalation. In some ways, this kind of dovetails with some of the things that you mentioned earlier about diplomacy in peacetime and the military taking the lead in wartime. But as you hinted at, the line becomes gray at certain points, and in the security dilemmas, one way in which that could happen. And I guess as a sort of sidecar to that, I would also ask what your thoughts are about what we're increasingly hearing coming out of Washington in some ways, but out of other corners as well, including here in Korea, about the wisdom of entering into some type of arms control relationship with North Korea that would imply some form of unspoken or de facto recognition of North Korea as a nuclear state. Thank you.
Good questions all. Seoul University or where?
I'm at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, Hankuk Wede.
Oh, okay. In our most private moments, Powell and I would have these conversations about countries like Cuba, North Korea, one or two others that have mellowed out now in terms of the relationship. And he would say things like, if we just opened up to North Korea the way George W. Bush was presenting to Kang Sak-ju and Yi Gun in 2002 until they admitted they had nuclear weapons, they put their economic proposal back in the briefcase and walked away. If we just opened up to North Korea in a significant sort of way, along with the ROC, I would never leave the ROC out. The ROC should lead this, and offered the kind of economic support that I think they really covet, and gave them the security guarantees along with it. And the guarantees would have to come from China, Japan, and Russia, and the United States at a minimum. All would have to be signatories to it. And we have worked that out. We had at the time worked that out. I think we could open a whole new era with North Korea. I think Powell was right when he said, Larry, if we did that, the regime would collapse, but it would collapse happily. And he said the same thing about Fidel Castro and the regime in Cuba. He said, if we just opened up and drowned them in what China ultimately has become drowned in. It's predatory capitalism, but it's capitalism, it's market, it's that sort of thing. If we did that and we made them the least bit prosperous, and we showed them what it could be like if they were that way, then they would collapse, they being the tyrants, whatever. I'm not so sure that he wasn't right. And George W. Bush was willing to take that package to Pyongyang. And unfortunately, when they told us that they had nuclear weapons and were arrogant about it, we put the package back in the briefcase and came home. I don't think you can do the other thing too. You can continue the present policy and just ad infinitum, ad nauseum. We're just going to, fire missiles at each other every now and then, but we'll never fire them at each other to hit each other. We'll do this, we'll do that. Maybe we'll sink a ship here, sink a ship there, whatever. We'll just keep doing it for another 50 years. That's feasible too. You could do that. That would satisfy the arms merchants better because they still sell weapons all over the place with regard to the peninsula. I'm wondering about how the Koreans would accept that though. And I'm wondering about polls that I've seen where young Koreans, those under 40, aren't too happy with what the situation might be called for the future. I saw a poll the other day that said those under 40 in Korea, better than 50% of them thought that perhaps the alliance was the biggest threat to their future. That's not good. Not as bad as Pakistan. Pakistan, it was something like 87% of the people in a poll said that the United States was the greatest threat to their future. Now, interestingly, India nor the United States is number 1 or number 2 to Pakistan. You know what the number 1 threat in the latest poll Pakistani people say is to Pakistan? Climate change. 1/3 of their country is underwater. And these polls, you know, they change weekly, monthly, yearly, whatever, but still, it's kind of disconcerting when you see Egypt. I was looking at Egypt too. Something like 80% of the people in Egypt think the United States is the number 1 threat to their future. Those are not good figures. I mean, you know, you say, well, Sisi's not a very good ruler, and we're backing Sisi, so the people don't like him. They don't like him any more than they like Mubarak. They'd like to get rid of him just like they did Mubarak, but he's got the military on his side. They can't do that. So that's why they hate us, because they see us as backing him. But, you know, these are disconcerting figures for a country that purports to be humanitarian and democracy and all that so many people don't like us. That's not a very good answer, but believe me, I've racked my brain over it. And if there was one thing Powell gave me my head on and told me, you know, come up with an alternative plan to what EAPR did, or come up with a different proposition with regard to Korea. He did it when he was chairman, and he did it when he was Secretary of State. And so we beat our heads together all the time on that issue, trying to figure out how to do something about it. And we never, you know, no one has succeeded in dealing with North Korea in a way that settles the problem, if you will.
It's a perfectly understandable answer to a difficult question. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Sure.
All right, that wraps up our time here, sir. Right at the hour, a little bit over.
You guys and gals look awful good for 8 a.m. in the morning. Must have a lot of coffee.
Thanks, sir. Well, we appreciate your time, sir, and it was a lot of great discussion and a lot of notes I took here. What led on, and I definitely led me on to Alan first. I'll look into that as well. And I like to leave everybody with a quote, because I have a quote that I have in my email signature that I've had for over a while, for a decade. And it's been Colin Powell's quote, and it goes something: I think whether you're having setbacks or not, the role of a leader is to always display a winning attitude. So I'd like to leave everybody with that before we end up this discussion. Again, sir, thank you for your time, and I thank everybody for their time here.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for all the work you do in a very difficult place.
Thanks, sir.
Take care.
You too.